So welcome to the Digital Economist from the World Economic Forum here in Davos, Switzerland. We are holding our inaugural roundtable, and we're very excited to have a huge turnover and a highly curated roundtable. The Digital Economist is an impact platform focused on thought leadership and bringing investable opportunities in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals to the fore. So we're very excited to welcome folks on January 23rd this evening, and looking forward to great partnership and a lot of value we create for the community along the way. So welcome. Okay, I think we can get started, Joe, if you're ready.
Yeah, let's talk immigration and the economy and how things are changing.
Let's do it. All right. Okay, so thank you for joining in, Joe, and welcome everyone, both here on the Zoom webinar, but also on Clubhouse. We have a bunch of attendees listening in. And my name is Navroop Sahdev, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Digital Economist, which is a global impact ecosystem focused on building the product, services, and the knowledge pieces toward a human-centered digital economy. And today we have actually a very special guest and a very important aspect of the economy, particularly the U.S. economy we were discussing, and very timely. So Joe Adams, thank you for joining us. And in full disclosure, Joe is also my immigration attorney. So that means this is coming from, right from home, and everything here is true and tried and tested. So Joe, welcome to the Speaker Series.
Thank you, Navroop. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be a part of your series. It's wonderful.
Fantastic. So we got a whole bunch of people here on Clubhouse, and I'm sure there are a whole bunch of questions, but also here on Zoom, I see Bridget and Saloni joining in. So Joe, before we kind of get into the commentary on Biden's immigration reform, something that has been due for the longest time, and also sort of, the extent of it, and talking about the U.S. immigration system and so on and so forth. I'd love to learn a little bit about your story. How did you decide to be an immigration lawyer? Were there some events or specific, I should say, triggers in your journey that triggered your interest in the space as a lawyer? So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Navroop. So as you can hear from my accent, I'm an American citizen. I was born in a very working class kind of part of the country, rural West Virginia. And when I was a child, we moved seeking better financial opportunities. My parents were seeking better financial opportunities, like many, many immigrants are. And we moved to California, where we pursued a free public education, great public schools. So I'm a product of the University of California undergrad and University of California Law School. I knew that I wanted to be involved in some sort of public service. I was always really interested in government and legislative affairs and public advocacy. And that was a lot of what drove my early career was advocacy for people who were unrepresented. I worked for the American Civil Liberties Union in San Diego for what they call the SPIN project, the Supportive Parents Information Network project, which was a project to help people transitioning out of welfare into the workplace. So that was sort of informed my early career. Decided to go into law. Didn't know exactly where I wanted to go. I knew that I liked talking. I knew that I was a pretty good writer and a good researcher. And so the early part of my legal career was working for the federal government. I worked for a federal agency called the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is in Washington, D.C. And what I saw there I worked for the number 2 lawyer in the agency. And what I saw there, this is going back to like 2004, 2005, at the height of the Iraq War, at the height of the discourse over whether George W. Bush should remain president or should we elect someone else, that someone else was John Kerry. Despite the contentious nature of the discourse going on in politics, the good work of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission to implement and execute the laws that were passed by Congress and implemented by the agency went on unabated by political considerations. And I'm referencing that because I am hopeful that as the Biden administration appoints executives to the Immigration Service, Customs and Border Patrol, and ICE, that we see a return to good governance, the boring, nonpartisan work of good governance. We have an immigration system in this country that is a product of many different inputs from Congress, from the executive, from court decisions, from patterns and practices and best practices of lawyers. We have this hodgepodge that was perverted in the last 4 years by an administration that was openly hostile towards every immigrant, not just the kids in cages, but even lawful immigrants from all over the world. And so as we return to a new sort of normal with the Biden administration, the biggest takeaway is he's appointing people who I believe will execute the law in good faith, similar to the way we executed the law in good faith when I was working for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which of course is an agency that has nothing to do with immigration. So that's what motivates me now. My journey into immigration came off the back of seeing a need in the space for competent, thorough, bespoke kinds of immigration services for various communities. And I naturally gravitated towards artists, entertainers, people in film and television, athletes, entrepreneurs. And that's how you and I became acquainted with one another and how we work together.
That is true. So unfortunately, I'm not an artist for my day job, although I would say, Joe, that I have been an artist before I was an economist, and I still paint and draw and all those things. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's so many threads there just from what you said. And so, did you say, Joe, that you're also, your parents are immigrants in the U.S., is that correct?
Our family are immigrants, and so when for instance the Trump administration promulgated a very controversial rule called the public charge rule, which is a subject that we can spend a great deal of time talking about. Basically, the Trump administration wanted to make it more difficult for low-income, low-education people to immigrate to the United States, and I took the analysis of the rule and I applied it to my own family situation and concluded that my ancestors who immigrated from Eastern Europe and Italy would not have been admitted. They were too poor. They were uneducated by modern standards. My immigrant ancestors didn't speak fluent English. They would not have been admitted under the Trump administration's public charge rule. So this is one of the back to normal kinds of things that we're looking to see is the welcoming of immigrants, even people who are of lower education backgrounds, people who aren't necessarily wealthy when they arrive.
Right. So, Joe, would you say that a lot of what you're doing, I love the fact that a lot of it is advocacy as well, to a great degree with a lot of your involvement. I remember just a story here, right? As we were talking on our email, you mentioned a racist system, and I kind of had a little bit of a moment, and I thought, wow, you know what? Lawyers are so politically correct. I just thought you were such an outlier in the space. So tell me a little bit more in detail, Joe, and our audiences here, both on Zoom and Clubhouse. about that, about your advocacy work?
Well, I'm a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which is the preeminent advocacy and educational organization. It represents about 12,000 immigration lawyers and judges throughout the United States. And then within the AILA framework, we have committees and subcommittees. We're coming up in May for our National Day of Action, which is a day that I've participated in every year for the last few years, where at least pre-COVID would fly to DC, meet with our local members of Congress and members of the Senate, meet with advocacy groups and advocate for change. This year, of course, it'll be virtual, but we're already really happy with where things are and where we hope to bring things with the Biden immigration bill, which was just introduced a few weeks ago.
Great. Yeah. So, before we kind of hop into the Biden's immigration bill, Joe, really kind of curious to hear a little bit about what kind of work are you currently engaged in, both from an immigration perspective, but I guess beyond that too. Is it mostly focused on the extraordinary talent visas? And I know there are a bunch of people in this room here who are interested in that, or is it more than that? So like I mentioned a moment ago, the immigration system is this imperfect, almost Tower of Babel kind of structure where we have imperfect rules and imperfect laws that we have to adapt to different situations. I imagine that many people on the call are familiar, at least, with the H-1B program, for instance, which is a pretty smooth program that's fatally flawed in that it's capped. And by the way, one of the problems with the Biden immigration bill, it does nothing to address the H-1 cap issue. Lately, I've been really involved in federal lawsuits. So for instance, just literally as of yesterday, I filed a federal lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Nebraska, because Nebraska is where one of the main processing centers are, where we send our cases. And they've been issuing some erratic and, in my view, extra legal, what we call ultra vires decisions. So we're being very aggressive in pursuing federal litigation to bring in a federal judge and advocating opposite a U.S. attorney who hopefully will see that the service centers that evaluate the case have been, let's say, off mission. And this fits with the pattern of the last 4 years, where USCIS was designed post 9/11 to be the benefits advisory and benefits adjudication entity, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, was to be the enforcement mechanism. There's been mission creep between ICE into USCIS, where it seems that rather than benefits adjudication, they're doing immigration enforcement. And that may not sound like a big difference, but believe me, it is. So for instance, an immigration officer is not supposed to insert his or her own subjective feelings about a case into a case, but that's exactly what we've seen. Navroop, the case that we filed for you, and I don't think we're talking out of school, you've talked about this in the past, we filed an EB-1 I-140 case. There has been no change to those rules in the last 4 years. But what did we see in terms of approval rates? It was like the fun part of a roller coaster. Down. It went from about 90% approval rates to 70% approval rates. Now, does that mean that individuals on the call should not consider filing their EB-1 I-140s? No. But as a systematic process, you have to say to yourself, what happened? The rules didn't change. The executive, the individuals in the executives changed. What else happened? So I think part of getting back to some sort of status quo is appointing immigration officials who have a serious intent to uphold the law and to evaluate and adjudicate the case fairly. I think there's a lot of opportunity there with the rescission of the Trump
green card ban. I was just saying, though, that particular issue didn't affect a lot of my clients who are in the US in status. And there seem to be ways to work around that particular issue. One of the lessons I take from Trump is that, when we were sitting here in 2017, very worried about what he could do, we didn't really realize the depth of the incompetence. Even just sort of basic phrases and terminology that would come out of Stephen Miller. If you don't know who Stephen Miller is, I consider you lucky. Stephen Miller would write things that Trump would sign that were so confusing and badly written that they would get challenged in court, and then it would just be done. I think the lesson from Trump and immigration is the next Trump, God forbid, will be more efficient. And one of the things I was very happy to see in the Biden immigration bill was basically a removal of executive power from the basis upon which Trump tried to ban people from majority Muslim countries. It's unusual to see a bill promoted by a president that seeks to strip the president of power, but I was very happy to see that particular part of the bill to divest that kind of sweeping power to a group of people. I can't remember exactly how it's structured, if it's a working group or if it's a group of the president and Congress. But in any case, the idea is, let's not give one guy all this power in the future.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you so much, Joe, for sharing these. And we'll open the conversation back up again to Clubhouse. Sophie, thank you so much for holding the guard down there. Really appreciate it while we had a little bit of a technological glitch. Speaking of which, Joe, I think I would really love for you to comment on, and Sophie just talked about how most of her clientele is startups, and I'm assuming mostly tech startups based out of the Silicon Valley. And so you work with artists and celebrities a lot. And I'm sort of curious to hear, what is the kind of the two worlds? How do they kind of intersect and overlap, particularly from an immigration perspective?
So I think when people hear about my clientele, they think there's some sort of secret back door to get. In fact, I've had clients who said, well, okay, you've told me about O1 visas, but what's the celebrity visa? There isn't. And there's a system set up that's been around since the early 1990s for high achieving individuals. And that can be a high achieving individual in science, technology, business. There are CFOs and C-suite people who go for the high achiever visas. And then there are niches within people's practices. There are colleagues of mine who focus on scientists, focus on engineers. I focus a lot on people in the creative industries, film, television, the arts, music, and entrepreneurs.
Right. So the high achiever visas, the O1, EB1, to your point, Joe, there is intersectionality. And so how does that play into, I guess, the bias that you were talking about when it comes to the actual folks who are looking over these visas? So I'm just really curious because, I should mention that we've done a whole bunch of work on behavioral economics, drawing from cognitive sciences, and Sophie just hopped off, but I think she's working in a stealth startup, something related to that as well, which I believe I'm not allowed to disclose. But I think cognitive sciences are sort of taking entire industries by the storm. And that's not something that's happening right now, but has been happening for a while now, right, from the 1970s, and particularly kind of accelerating from the 1990s. So I'm really curious to hear, what would you say we need to do in order to make, I guess, the immigration system a lot more objective and less subjective, and hence prey to human biases and also just political stuff, right, that you were just talking about? So this is a great question, which give me a moment to unpack, because there's a few aspects of it. First,
if anyone ever took a law class on bias, on like say employment discrimination, employers are sophisticated enough to know that they would never say, I'm not going to hire a person because she's a woman. I'm not going to promote someone because she's a particular ethnic or racial background. I'm not going to fire someone because he's gay. Most employers, although I've had cases like that, most employers know to not utter those words, even though that might be animating what they're doing. Also, when we talk about the world of implicit bias, bias that is activated upon on an unconscious level, that's even harder to pin down in the law. What the courts did in the 1970s and 1980s in creating the modern civil rights law that we have in this country, say in employment, in housing, in government benefits, et cetera, is to do statistical modeling. Where they take statistical models of various applicants and various systems, and that can be used to identify where bias is taking place. And in the way the law works is if you're able to show a court that bias is taking place, it creates what's called a rebuttable presumption that the government has to then produce evidence to rebut. I think something similar in immigration should be warranted. I have never received a request for evidence or a denial decision or any adverse action where the officer says, we're denying because the person's Black, we're denying because the person is gay, we're denying because the person is from XYZ country or ethnic origin. What I have seen is, for instance, a pattern that comes to mind is, say, a Black actor from Europe or from the UK receiving a much more intense request for evidence than their white counterpart. I've also seen it where they'll ask for extraneous information or unrelated information. I had a case of an actor, an actor of African origin, British national, who received a request for evidence where they are asking for English language translations of all the non-English material, but everything we submitted was in English. All of his acting credits were in the UK. And now, was that an example of bias playing through the system? I'll never know that on that individual case, but I think if you got enough immigration lawyers together, we would come to the conclusion that there is, Eurocentric bias that goes on in the immigration system, and it is not written into the immigration system to have that bias. An O1 visa for an artist, a P1 visa for an athlete, an H1B visa for a technical worker should be administered according to the law and not incorporate bias. So that's one area where I could see some improvement, where there's statistical models drawn on the race and ethnicity and gender of applicants. To my knowledge, it's not. And then who got requests for evidence, who got denial decisions or other adverse decisions. Another thing, and then the other part of that, which we see in the Biden immigration bill, is training. People forget that when they go to Customs and Border Patrol, when they turn up at the airport, the person in the box, that's how they refer to it. The person in the box is a Customs and Border Patrol officer who learned immigration on flashcards. They learned immigration on flashcards. So that person's not a lawyer. They're not necessarily someone who's had much thought or sensitivity in, say, different cultures or different backgrounds. That's the lower level position that people get into when they start at Customs and Border Patrol. So training of Customs and Border Patrol in the law, in civil rights, in ethnic sensitivity, bias training, that's a part of the Biden immigration bill. So I'm happy to see that moving forward.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, everything you talked about, Joe, right there. It's just shocking, I guess, when you come to the U.S., right? And you think these must be really competent people, because my fate is going to be decided by whether or not this person lets me enter the country, right there and then. And then with what you're sharing, oh my God, I think that's news to a lot of us.
Well, pre-Trump, I would get the sense that my clients have this impression of the U.S. federal government like it was something that you would see in like 24 or Mission Impossible, like these rooms full of computers and like sweat-stained scientists glugging down coffee and comparing data. And it's so much more primitive than that. I took a tour of the processing facility a few years back, and believe me, it's paper files, old-fashioned paper files stacked from the floor to the ceiling, held together with rubber bands in brown paper envelopes, and windowless cubicles as far as the eye could see. So, it's what we have. It's what we have right now as our system. It's certainly imperfect, and it's prone to error. If the error comes from, a messy workplace, that's one thing. If the error comes from bias, racism, homophobia, ethnic bias, religious bias, whatever it is, we can certainly address that.
Right. And so, Joe, would you say, and this may be a little bit more kind of expanding the scope of the question here, would you say that is true for the other departments of the government as well? Or is immigration something that has sort of been left behind? And that just sounds like 100 years old sort of way of doing things and learning things and assessing, cases.
I don't know that I could speak to the other branches of the federal government, but I would have a few points in response, which is factually, the USCIS runs 100% or 99.5% or something like that off user fees. So user fees, the filing fees that you pay for the operation of USCIS. It doesn't take any money from Congress. So when it comes time for oversight, it's not as if the oversight committees or the budget committees have those strings over USCIS. So that's one issue. The other issue, I think, is that implicit USCIS is not there to do law enforcement. It's there to adjudicate benefits. But the mission creep of the enforcement agencies, I think, can pervade into other areas. So that's a cultural issue that I think comes from the top, and it comes from the tone that's being set. And people will make fun of it. They'll say it's excessively politically correct. But one of the changes is Biden is replacing the term, I hate this term, illegal alien, with non-citizen. You dehumanize someone when you call them an illegal alien.
Right.
Even when we talk about you, Navroop, as an alien of extraordinary ability, that's a little dehumanizing.
What does that mean? From Mars.
Right. You and the Curiosity rover, you and the Perseverance rover. And,
right. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I think so overdue, all of these and more. So we have a number of people in the audience here, both on Zoom, that I encourage all of you to post your questions for Joe here. If you have any specific questions related to immigration or even general ones, as you can tell, Joe is very well plugged into the ecosystem, both from the advocacy front, but also where the direction of the reforms are in the US and beyond. And if you are in the audience in Zoom, in Clubhouse, I would just say, just raise your hands and we'll get back to you in the next few minutes as we wrap up the Zoom webinar here. And so just to kind of open this up, Joe, a little bit, the conversation to, the other things that concern us in the world. How would you sort of like comment on the U.S. immigration in the larger context of globalization?
That's a great question and a tough one to respond to. So where does U.S. immigration fall in the mixture? Well, I can just report the feedback that I get from my clients. The feedback that I get from my clients from all over the world, from India, from China, from Japan, from Europe, is there's a feeling in many countries where once you reach a certain level, you've reached the top of your profession, and the U.S. is where people want to come to get to a different level or a higher level. There have been many clients who have said to me, my last name is not the kind of last name of a person who gets promoted to XYZ. If I'm not in with the right crowd of people, ... And certainly we've been talking about bias in the immigration system, but one of the areas where people really seem to thrive in the U.S. is that sense of reinvention and that sense of diversity that we have as a society. People don't like the melting pot example, but I'm an old millennial, and it's the one I grew up with. The melting pot example is an example of people, who want to make a better life for themselves or for their families, whether it's family-based immigration or employment-based immigration. They want to seek out a better economic future, a better quality of life.
Right. So you're basically saying we'll continue to see a lot of interest in immigrating to the U.S. because of the unique mixture of things that are available in this economy compared to many others. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, that's a fair general statement that I would agree with. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So interesting. So we actually do have a question here from Saloni on the Zoom webinar, and she's asking, what is the biggest challenge you face working with, I guess, such huge people? She means celebrities that you've sponsored and helped a lot of the visas with, Joe.
It's interesting. I've had the pleasure of working with people who are at various different levels of their careers, and I think the most important thing to do is set expectations, and I think that's true for any professional, is to set realistic expectations in terms of timing, in terms of outcome with their clients. I can't say that I've had, I think sometimes quote unquote celebrities gets kind of a bad rap. We go through an immigration process just like anyone else, and we don't ask for any special favors. When I do have very high profile people who have to, for instance, go to the U.S. Embassy, I will sometimes email the embassy and say, hey, I've got so-and-so coming in a few days, and I know this might be disruptive, and I just don't want your lobby to be disrupted by other applicants who are there for their purposes, but we don't ask for any sort of special treatment or special favors of anyone.
Gotcha. Cool. So that's super interesting. And I think there's a follow-up here, Saloni. To what extent does immigration affect globalization of a country? So, I'm guessing, Saloni, by globalization here, you mean the integration with the global economy, right? And just to kind of, before Joe, you go into that question, obviously the degree of openness in immigration would dictate the degree of globalization as well. But Joe, I want to toss a question to you for a more nuanced sort of answer or response to that. But just from a high level, I think kind of good to get that out of the way.
Globalization, I read that as integration of economic development and job creation, which is the underpinning of the U.S. system of employment-based immigration. So the basis for the U.S. Employment-based immigration system is to attract qualified workers in a given field. We've talked a lot about the O visa, extraordinary ability visa, but tied to that visa is always an itinerary of upcoming events. The immigration officers themselves give some deference, I am told, in off the record, to the fact that we're trying to bring, U.S. employers are trying to bring in high skilled people, whether it's the H-1B program, the E-2 investor visa program, the L-1 intra-company transfer visa program, or the extraordinary ability O visa program, or I would add to that the P visa, the athlete visa. All of that is underpinned by economic development and job creation. And there are statistics that immigration advocates can sort of rattle off about the dollars that are generated by immigrants and the jobs that are created by immigrants as always being a net positive. And I think for a community like this that's very interested in global markets and globalization, I think sometimes we have to take a step back and remember we just went through a hell of a time because we have immigration skeptics and we have white nationalists who represent a small but very vocal minority, not just in the US, but in other places as well, that we have to contend with. And I think we need to address some of those issues that factually and with an amount of compassion. I think that we have to address those issues that an immigrant is not taking away a job from an American. And in fact, an immigrant and the virtue of their work authorization builds out the economy and leads to greater job creation. And to approach any sort of rational based fear, I mean, you're always going to have people who are just racist and who are just nativist. You're always going to have that in any large population. But for those who we can approach, we've got to peel some of those people off, because otherwise we're going to end up with a hard right legislature who wants to turn off the tap of immigration, and no one wants that. No one in this community wants that.
Which is a net positive for all sides. And that has been empirically true for over the years, Joe, to what you just talked about. So, I guess my question here, Joe, to you, and hold on for everybody who's joining us here on Clubhouse, and we'll open the conversation up in the next few minutes. But kind of returning to your commentary on, racism and biases, the way it's playing out in immigration and U.S. immigration future, for that matter. And you also mentioned, Joe, just for greater context here for the audience who are just sort of joining us, and kind of to reset the room real quick, you talked about the Biden administration making some really useful, helpful changes that have been proposed as part of the bill overhauling the U.S. immigration. But I did read that not a lot has is sort of in the pipeline for change regarding the actual rules that determine these visas, particularly the employment visas, right? So, okay, the country limits would probably be removed, but the actual criteria. And I wonder if the criteria doesn't change, or the objectivity and unbiasedness that's sort of needed for a better immigration system is not embedded in those new reforms. So what would change, in fact? And then, a follow-up to that, Joe, just kind of lining up the question here would be, there is, of course, the 11 million or more illegal immigrants. I'm sure you get this question all the time. And there's a path to citizenship for them. And so you work with some of the top talent in the country. How do you kind of see this juxtaposition? Because I've heard a lot of people also saying, okay, well, we came here legally and we spent 7 years trying to, get some of these top tier visas. We worked our asses off, or what have you, right? So how do you see both of these issues?
So in terms of the bill that's been proposed to Congress, sure, it's not perfect and it's not complete in my view, but what it does is it removes the per country limits. If people don't know, there are calculated percentages of different categories of green cards that can be issued in a given period of time, and that's based on historical immigration patterns. Right now, as we sit here today, because of high demand for immigrants from certain countries like China and India and the Philippines, those are categories that we call oversubscribed. So people have to wait in line, basically. And sometimes the wait will be for years and years and years. Two of the important attributes of the Biden bill: one, it provides for a work authorization and a travel authorization for people who are waiting in line. And the other important part is it reconfigures the way different categories are counted as we phase out the per country limits. I know this is a little bit technical, but the net, and not every immigration lawyer will agree with me, but the net is that I think the system becomes more fair to the applicants who are qualified. One of the things that I think are missing from the bill is an entrepreneur visa. If people recall, back in 2013, President Obama and then Speaker Paul Ryan had worked out a pretty decent immigration bill, which passed the Senate, but couldn't pass the House, even though Paul Ryan was the Speaker of the House, because of some nativist concerns, I think. One of the attributes of that bill was an entrepreneur visa, which had its own, it had its own processes. One of the things that Paul Ryan said, which I think everyone can agree with, is we shouldn't have a second class of people living in the US. And Navroop, this goes to your second point. How do we deal with the 11 million or so people who are here without authorization? Remember, many of the people who are here without authorization came to the US lawfully as students, as tourists, and they just never left. And they did that because of a multitude of reasons. Many of them are financial, some of them are humanitarian, and they never went back to their home countries. So what we have to look for is getting people out of the shadows, getting people regularized, normalized, and into the system. A lot of focus is paid to the dreamers, the people who came here when they were children, taken here, brought here by their parents, and who have known no other country. And then there are people who came here as young adults, who came here middle life, and to normalize their status. So we don't have a permanent class of people who are living on the margins of society, I think would be an important development and is a critical component to the Biden bill.
Absolutely. And I think, Joe, that's such an excellent point, the reminder you gave us that these folks actually came on an authorization before they just didn't leave, right? And I think a lot of people tend to forget that the image that's portrayed is people illegally jumping the wall in Mexico or something, right? I remember this one article which commented on the H-1B visas and the rules that Trump put in place in the last administration in trying to restrict legal migration, what you earlier commented on, and with the pictures and portraying this problem with illegal immigration. And it's funny because the picture that's accompanied the article was refugees holding cans of water in like a desert-like environment and walking in their flip-flops. And I thought, oh yeah, that's exactly right. That's how all the H-1B workers came into the US.
It's a weird and very dated image. And being someone who grew up in Southern California, in San Diego, which is the last city before the Mexico border, it's an image that you grow up with. It's a racist image in my view. I don't really care how people came here. If they hiked across the desert, or they arrived as a victim of human trafficking in a shipping container, or they came as a tourist and never left, they're here and they don't have a place to go back to. So that's me being just a bleeding heart liberal, but this image, human. The person in this, this poor person in rag clothing coming through the desert, that person is seeking a better life, just like my ancestors did. And I don't see much of a difference between that person and some ancient regime ancestor of mine. The ancient regime, like prior to the 1950s, you basically had to have a letter from a relative, which anyone can get, saying that I agree. It's basically a handwritten letter. I've seen them. I've seen my family's own sponsorship documents. It's a handwritten letter saying, I agree that this person coming from Italy or Norway or wherever can stay with me and I'll take care of them. That was it. That was the immigration system for a lot of people, especially white people. That was their immigration history.
Right. And I think, Joe, that hasn't quite changed, right? When we talk about references like the visitor visas, similar. It's so funny. I think years, probably like 100 years later, it's the same thing. You still write a similar letter, right? Saying, okay, we'll take care of your expenses and accommodation, this and that. And that continues to be the case, certainly for the family visas, but to a great degree for employment and visitor visas as well.
Certainly for tourist visas, there's certainly a holdover for Indian nationals, Chinese nationals, Russian nationals coming to the U.S. They need to prove to the U.S. authorities why they're coming and who they're coming to see.
Right. And I think it's worth remembering that even passports, like just 2 or 3 generations ago, most of the people did not have passports, right? And visas were not a thing just 1 generation ago. And you know, like really after World War II was really when the whole visa systems started. And that's because a lot of the colonies were getting independence from, the imperial powers, if you may, and they didn't want these people to then come back into their countries, right? They wanted them to stay where they were. So, for example, Indians or Pakistanis are now, going to the UK, for example. So, I mean, to I guess at a larger level, at a much more of a macro global perspective, I think, I wonder if it would be fair to say that the whole thing about immigration system, and perhaps why, Joe, you have the job that you have, it's actually a legacy of imperialism and to a great degree slavery as well. What we see in the world. And, from, I guess, wearing my entrepreneurial hat, what would be really awesome is to have less and less boundaries, right? We talked about how the entire GDP of the world can triple or double right away if people were allowed to move wherever they wanted to. So kind of how do you see that, dynamic playing out, the world being flatter and flatter with digital technologies, and now with COVID, we really are a true interdependent whole, and sort of the future of immigration. And with that, we also want to hear some of your last, I guess, message to the audience here before we move the party to Clubhouse and people can ask more questions directly. And what would you leave us with? So
2 points. One is practical but big picture, and the other is me and my endless optimism. Okay, first, I think the next 10 to 15 years, looking at the United Kingdom and Brexit, will be the instructive example of how globalism and how the point that you mentioned about borders and the movement of goods plays out. Someone smarter than me said Brexit was the UK imposing a tariff on itself. It had there was no issue with cross-country migration, within the EU, no issue with movement of goods. Now the UK has decided that that's what they want, for reasons that I think are silly. But the UK has decided that that's what they want. Now, in the next 10 to 15 years, does the UK decide, hey, we're okay with that? We're okay with having entry requirements and fees and assessments and import duties and cargo inspection for the movement of goods when it comes to Europe? Or do they seek to rejoin the EU at some point in the next, I think, 10 to 15 years? If I were to bet, I bet it's the latter. And I think the lesson is exactly what you've said, which is that the simpler and more predictable the law is, and the gradual loosening of intense trade restrictions, the better off people will be. I think that has to be accompanied by in-country regulation. The reason you can import, say, medical devices from Germany into the UK without inspection is because the medical devices were up to, say, a standard, up to a certain standard. So if the US were to at some point talk about deregulating its border when it comes to goods and people, you have to have the trans-country relationships to make sure that the things and people are regulated. That's where I see things going in the next 10 to 15 years. In terms of individuals making immigration decisions, you lose 100% of the shots you don't take. The way to test, do I have enough evidence? The way to test it is to file a case, and to be an optimistic person. There's this. I know we're on a verbal platform, but there's this image that I really like to share with people, especially people who come from cultures that are more conservative, or where modesty is of greater value. And it's this little girl, and she's in her little tutu, and she's got all of her trophies around her for her baton twirling. She's got a baton held triumphantly over her head. I'll send it to you, Navroop. You can send it. I don't know. I think it encapsulates how you have to approach certain things in life, including immigration. You have to be proud of what you've done. You can't be bashful, and you have to be willing to put yourself out there.
That's amazing, Joe. Thank you so much. I think that's such an inspiring note to end the formal conversation on. And before we kind of move to Clubhouse, to take the shots in your life. You only get one life, and own the successes that you have accumulated, and I guess with a little sense of humility. So with that, thank you very much, Joe, for joining us. Again, I'm Navroop Sahdev, and today we were joined by Joe Adams, who is an immigration lawyer out of California, Los Angeles. And thank you again for joining us on Zoom, and we will be in Clubhouse in 5 seconds. So thank you again.